Well, I don't know if you've looked at the sermon title. What is that smell and what are we going to do about it? I think it's great that we can come here on a day like today and smell the sweetness of God, to smell the sweetness of children and songs and prayer. But when I read today's gospel passage, when I first read it, my mind immediately went back to my childhood and my experiences with manure. Despite what you might think, I have very fond memories of my experiences with manure. I grew up and knew all four of my grandparents. 2 lived a block that way and 2 lived a block that way. And they had all been through hard times. They had lived through the Depression, the Great Wars. They had worked as sharecroppers. They had gone hungry. They had been unemployed. And having had these experiences, they had learned how to grow things. They were excellent gardeners. And they had learned the importance of growing your own food, and they were really good at it. My grandfather on my mom's side of the family taught me about growing things, and along with my grandmother, they grew a beautiful, beautiful vegetable garden. And my grandmother had a yard and a porch full of flowers, and they were the envy of the entire town. And everyone always wanted to know, Harvey, Vera, what is the secret to your beautiful garden and your flowers? And the secret was manure. During my grandparents' younger years, they could simply go out to the barn and gather the manure and put it on the garden. But since we lived in the city, manure was not something you could just go out and gather up. So during the winter, my grandfather and I would load up the trunk of the car with 5-gallon buckets, and we would drive out Sweden's Cove Road, or we would take the ferry across the river to some unknown farm and collect buckets of manure. Now, 2 things happen when you gather manure, and I know this is more information than you could possibly ever want or need, but you know the apocalypse is coming. First, you have to take a gardening fork in order to flip the manure off the ground so that you can put it in the bucket. Now, what you may not know is that when you flip the manure up, you will encounter underneath this manure a whole bunch of wiggling red worms. Now, the red worms also have to be gathered, and they are put into a separate bucket because, you see, my grandfather Harvey also sold fishing bait. And he was known to have the biggest and the juiciest red worms around. And again, the secret was manure. These red worms were collected and put in his boxes when we got back home. Now, the worm boxes were a busy place where worms turned garbage into rich soil, and that rich soil, along with the manure, which my grandfather scattered over the garden all winter, and my grandmother filled her flower pots and boxes, that was the secret to the bountiful harvest and the fragrant flowers. It was natural for the worms to do their thing in turning the manure and the table scraps into rich soil, but the manure in the garden had to be tilled. The manure had to be given time to decay, mix with the soil and the creatures of the soil to make the rich, fertile soil that yielded those bountiful crops. In our parable about the fig tree today, we don't know if the manure the farmer added around the roots of the fig tree paid off or not. But we do know that the farmer knew that the stinky waste of barnyard animals could be used with the ailing of the fig tree, and that it needed constant, probably daily attention to keep it healthy and free of pests. In addition to the manure, it needed water and, of course, fresh air. I don't know about you, but I have certainly encountered my share of manure in my life. Some of it could have been avoided, and some of it just showed up without warning and uninvited. I'm not really sure if I believe what some people say about God not giving us more than we can bear, or that no matter what kind of manure comes your way, there's a reason for it, and we have to learn how to turn that manure into fertilizer. Might be true. Surely it is possible in some cases, But you have to have a whole different way of looking at manure and thinking about manure. If you are repulsed by the way manure looks, or where it came from, or how it smells, and the inconvenience of it all, you might not be able to shovel it into the soil and make something good out of it. You might not be able to discover the secrets that live underneath and creating a whole and other fertile community unknown to the rest of the world. All of us have had experiences with manure in our lives. Manure happens and it stinks. Think about those stinky experiences in your life. The time a friend or a loved one betrayed you. It stinks. The time that love was supposed to be forever and disintegrated right before your eyes. Remember how that stunk? Or maybe it was the time that someone you loved died. And remember how shocked to the point of unbelief you were? Do you remember the fear? Do you remember the anger? Do you remember the denial? And then the stinky, repulsive day that reality set in and you would no longer see this person again or be in their lives? There's a lot of stink in our lives and in the world. And how can we ignore the stink of our world right now? On more than one day this week, as I watched the news, and God help me as I scrolled my Facebook feed, the world of stink would come rising through the ethers and have me so riled up on some days that I could hardly think straight. The smell of governors rejecting the suffering refugees was so reviling, I wanted to sling a little of my own stinkiness in their direction. The pictures, the stories of innocent people, really people like you and me, with children, jobs, families, and a whole other life, being forced to leave their homes and to live with barely more than the clothes on their back. It stinks. To think that they have traveled on foot, wagging infant in arms, lacking food, water, and shelter for weeks on end, taking the last of their finances to pay someone to ferry them in unsafe boats across dreaded seas to a land they know nothing about, to a place that is strange, to try and start over with nothing, to be interviewed, judged, examined, sorted, and sent on their way with only the hope that eventually, God help them, they will find a safe place, no matter how far away or foreign, and then to be denied. It stinks. It smells. It's rotten. In all of the Abrahamic traditions, whether you are Christian, Muslim, or Jew, we are taught to welcome the stranger. As we have been reminded in the last week or so, Mary and Joseph themselves were refugees fleeing religious and political persecution. And yet, our so-called brothers and sisters of faith, our religious leaders, and politicians who have run on Christian religious platforms have chosen fear over love and refused to participate in the founding political principles of our nation and our faith. What are we to do? How are we to respond when life gets the better of us, when we lose hope, when our deepest beliefs are challenged? It stinks. What are we supposed to do when suffering is all around and all rational thought is bound by fear and anger? It stinks. What are we to do when our very faith is questioned, when Bible verses are slung around like nursery rhymes and prayers seem hollow and shallow and barely whisper across our lips? It stinks. I don't pretend to be wise enough to answer that question. I can only invite you to ponder with me what we as people of faith are to do about that. As people of faith, there are any number of biblical references that we could turn to in our times of despair. After all, if our faith has taught us anything, it is that in these moments of despair, we will always encounter them. The Old Testament lesson for today comes from the prophet Micah, and this passage comes after a series of laments, threats, and discriminations against the nation of Israel, also known as stinky times. And they remind us that in our lament, in threatening, and in times of discrimination, we are to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. In other words, if we are people of faith, we've already been doing that. It's a part of our daily practice. You see, as people of faith, we are called to do justice, love mercy or kindness, and to walk humbly with God at all times, and especially in the tough times. This is one of the ways that we can get through the stink. But in order to do that, we have to be clear in our own individual and collective hearts and minds that we are people of justice, and that we do love mercy, and that we do walk humbly with God. And that means that each of us must have a daily practice that puts us in touch with what it means to be the people of justice, to be the people who love mercy, and to be the people who walk humbly with God. If we do not practice this on a daily basis, if we do not have a practice, a daily practice that we always work on, always, when life is just rolling along, then we will not be able to rise to the challenge when life gets stinky. Our daily practice opens our spiritual eyes to see things as they really are, and opens our heart to love so that we have the capacity for justice and mercy and a humble walk with God. And here, my friends, my brothers and sisters, is where we, as the people of God, the Church of Jesus Christ, really need to step up the pace of our spiritual lives. Because it's easy to sit here in this place and feel the love. And it's easy to talk about what we should or shouldn't do in any given situation. But unless we know how to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly during the most difficult moments of life, we will fail. And if in the difficult of moments of life we turn to fear and anger and judgment and retaliation and greed and envy, you get my drift, then we've turned from God. It is in the difficult moments that we put into practice what our daily disciplines teach us to do. If we do not practice love, justice, mercy, and kindness in the day-to-day of our lives, how can we do it when the challenges come? Brothers and sisters, the church at one time held as one of its chief responsibilities to be a place where you could learn and be guided in a daily spiritual practice, to guide you in your daily walk so that when the day of difficulty comes, you simply go on automatic pilot and you keep doing what you've always done every day for all your life. You pray. You read your holy text. You listen. You commune. I have concerns about the institutional church and whether or not that's going on. All the spiritual disciplines of the world teach the need for a daily practice. And the church used to be the leader in teaching people how to form a daily practice, to get them through the rough days, and especially through the difficult times. And at the center of that practice is the practice of stillness or listening, or whatever you want to call it. In Christian circles, we call it obedience, which comes from the word obeir, which means to hear. Do you have a daily practice of listening? Because if we do not listen on a daily basis, how will we listen when our world is turned upside down? We are expert in prayers of petition. We are experts at telling God what we want and what we need and what we think God ought to do. But brothers and sisters, I'm not sure how much listening we do in our lives. It is the daily practice of listening that opens our hearts to love in the most difficult moments. It is the practice of listening that opens our spiritual eyes to see the reality of God's creation, which is, by the way, a creation of love, hope, peace, and joy. It is this daily practice that gives us the strength and the courage to stand for justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Without a daily practice, we are as a sounding brass and clanging cymbals. All walk, all talk, and no action. Or worse yet, actions based in false knowledge and assumptions, based entirely in the logical earthly realm, with no concern for spirit or heart. In the stinkiest moments of life, we are called to breathe peace and to drink in joy and partake of the food of love. We cannot do this in the stinky moments of life if we don't do it every day. These are free gifts to all of us. And that's why the farmer tends the tree every day, giving it nourishing water and keeping the weeds at bay every day, making sure the locusts don't eat it up, so that when the time comes, the fruit will come forth. If you do not have a daily practice of listening or any kind of daily practice, or you want to know more about a daily practice, if you want someone to guide you and help you figure out what a daily practice might look like, please let me know. It is my desire that as people of faith, we live our lives moment by moment in love and joy and peace and hope, because, brothers and sisters, that is what it means here on Christ the King Sunday to proclaim the kingdom of Christ here and now in our hearts and in our lives and in the world. And when we do that, we are safe and we are protected and we are free. And that, my friend, is what God calls us to in the world every day and in the stinky moments. I believe that is part of what it means to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. And I believe that that's how we get through the stinky moments of life. It keeps our hearts and our spirits open to the ever-redeeming, unlimited possibilities of God and God's love for each of us, our neighbor, and, oh yeah, by the way, our enemy. It is my prayer for peace and justice in the world, but even more my prayer is that each of us will walk daily in humility with God, so that we do love mercy daily, and that we do live justice daily. Because in that way, we change not only our lives, we change the world, and we bring about the kingdom of God. May God help us. Amen.